Welcome to Graphite Hub's interview series, a series dedicated to all things graphite. Now, today I'm joined by James Cross, CEO of ePower Resources. So, James, it's great to have you with us.
Yeah, good to be here, Harry.
Fantastic. So, just yesterday, James, ePower released phase one results of the 2025 exploration program at Tetepisca. So, would you mind just walking us through the key highlights from this announcement?
Yeah, we were following up on some surface targets on the property and went out there and were able to sample some geophysical targets and basically scrape away the overburden, which might be a meter would be extreme, and take some samples of visible graphitic rock, which is sometimes visible without scraping anything away. And on a number of showings, we got some very high grade results and also were able to discover yet another from surface showing along a 12-kilometer long geophysical target. And we know there to be graphite along that 12-kilometer long physical target. But these samples were taken from an area we'd not yet discovered before. So adding to the thesis that that entire 12-kilometer long geophysical, call it structure, could be rather continuous with a lot of graphitic rock.
Right. Okay. No, that sounds promising. But maybe stepping back a little bit for Graphite Hub viewers who might not be too familiar with ePower's story, would you mind just walking us through the history of ePower and what the future plan is?
Yeah, sure. We started the business in late 2018, and the business was all about finding a way at the time. It's evolved a little bit now, but at the time it was about finding a way to make money in the resources business around the growth in electric vehicle or lithium ion batteries. So we looked at all the material components of EV batteries and determined that the one most likely to face a supply crisis would be graphite. 7 years later, it looks as though we were probably right. So, and the business really was all about discovering or securing and developing graphite in the ground and then monetizing it without actually going into production or especially trying to seize multiple links of a supply chain. Many of our peer companies have veered off that single link in the supply chain, which is graphite in the ground, and gone into things like building 3 or 4 or $500 million factories to make battery anode material. We're not in the bread making business. We're in the dough business. Day for our Dutch, Swedish speaking shareholders, and Tay for German. We're focused on the dough, not on baking bread and coming up with a better process to make bread. We just want that one essential link in the supply chain, which is graphite in the ground, and we want to monetize it.
So, building on the strategy in a bit more detail, you've said that ePower's model isn't to spend hundreds of millions of dollars building a downstream facility, but to prove in ground value. So, what kind of acquirer do you see as the most likely fit? Do you see it as a battery anode material producer, another graphite company? Who do you see there as the right fit?
Yeah, I think one of the most likely fits would be a manufacturer who desperately needs graphite and is risking their entire business by remaining reliant on sources both across the world and on the other side of the geopolitical wall. At the same time, Western mining companies have not been in graphite for 70 years for the most part, with a few very tiny exceptions. So, like the Rio Tintos, they might want to get into graphite, or even Teck might want to get into graphite. And we also have the Glencore type companies, the traders. They see that graphite emerging as a problem in the West, and maybe now it's a supply chain they would like to gain, or a link in the supply chain they would like to gain control of. So it could be any of those three, or even a JV or partnership combination of two or three of those.
Yeah. Okay. And then so for ePower to become a acquisition target, what milestones do you think needs to happen between now and then?
Yeah, I think we're already there. I think we're already an acquisition target just because, North America needs 40 projects like this, and there are only 10. So yeah, it's already happened, and yeah, we're here.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's promising. And then maybe let's jump back into the project in a bit more detail. So the location of the project is in Quebec, and so across the graphite supply chain, we are seeing that Canada is becoming quite a favorable location for the both battery and mining sectors. You know, we're seeing refundable exploration credits and major infrastructure investments. So how critical is the location of where ePower's deposits are in terms of making more progress?
Yeah, well, the big industrial consumers that ultimately will need what we've got in the ground are really located in North America and Europe. And we're about 3 hours and 15 minutes north of Baie-Comeau, Quebec. And Baie-Comeau is a port on the mouth of the St. Lawrence. So it sits in the very northeast of North America. So sailing time to, say, Hamburg, Germany is a week. So it's very close to serving Europe and also has ground transport links to and barge access to the interior of the North American continent through the Great Lakes. So it's really perfectly positioned around many different nodes of transportation, and you can drive right to it. And you can sleep in a hotel while you're visiting the property. It's a hotel meant for work crews in the hydroelectric power, forestry, and mining industries. But it's a hotel.
Well, no, I think a tier one jurisdiction, right, is key for the graphite sector at the moment. You know, we do see, yeah, geopolitics plays quite a huge part. So, yeah, a location like Canada is key. But of course, stepping back a little bit, you know, graphite isn't just about batteries. We're seeing demand across a number of different areas, such as defense and industrial applications, is playing a key demand for graphite. So, how important are these alternative markets for graphite in terms of e-power?
Yeah, I think they're perhaps even more important than just lithium ion batteries. They're even more essential. Like, you could call the EV thing, it's a political agenda. The other types of cars work fine. Now you need graphite for those too. It's really basic industry, that products we use every day. Anything requiring power, you need graphite for. And very often it's a very tiny percentage of the cost of a product containing it or requiring it. So price increases. In other words, if we're able to, not us, but whoever takes the project from us and decides to put it into production, that they're not going to be able to compete with China on price, but they don't have to, because in graphite, it's all about, can you get it, not necessarily what you pay for it. And I'll give you an analogy there. It's, imagine a restaurant is unable to get any salt. What do? And you can find some, but it costs 10 times as much. Who cares? Get some salt. And it doesn't even affect the overall cost of their products.
Yeah, no, that's a quite a fascinating analogy. And essentially, you do need the salt, so you are going to pay what you need, right?
Yeah, it's essential. So your whole business manufacturing falls apart if you can't get the essential raw materials for what you're making.
Yeah. And then looking ahead for e-power resources over the next, say, 12 to 18 months, what are the key milestones that you and the team are working on at the moment?
Well, one of the big things is, we're out there, still beating the drum about graphite.
Yeah.
And, we're kind of at a standoff with industry in many ways because Western companies have not been in graphite for 70 years. I think there's reluctance to get in and figure out how to do it. And, how many purchasing managers responsible for getting graphite have the authority to invest in mining and exploration projects? The entire way of acquiring it has to change. And I think industry's being slow to change. So over the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to continue to develop the project, and we want to do it in a non or less dilutive way. So if we raised, call it, $5 or $6 million right now, and went out with a drill, we could easily drill a 43101 resource. We don't have a 43101 resource now, but how much do we dilute if we go do that? We're searching for less dilutive ways to finance that, or just ways we can offload the project to someone else who will spend their money doing that. And as a percentage of the budget for one of those big traders or manufacturers or mining companies, that dollar figure is tiny when you're risking everything, because if you don't have graphite, the rest of the business closes down.
Exactly. I think we rely on China for about 98% of the active anode materials. So, look, something needs to change soon, right? We can't keep going down this path.
Yeah, definitely. And, there's need for downstream capacity too, but we don't feel an exploration company is the company to deliver that. Instead, we're going to stick to the one link in the supply chain. We know there are lots of people good at making bread. We just need to help make sure they have some dough.
Yeah, okay. Well, no, look, it sounds like things are progressing well for e-power, but it is hard to ignore that graphite companies have faced quite a challenging time over the last few years. And look, I started this podcast maybe about a year and a half ago, and it's just a common theme. Every one of these interviews, we are talking about the challenges that graphite companies are facing. So, for e-power, what do you see as the biggest hurdles over the foreseeable future, and how are you planning on overcoming these?
Well, yeah, one of those hurdles is dilution. The share prices of companies in this space have been pretty bad, really. And every time you want to advance the project to ultimately deliver it to industry, you do so at tremendous cost to the shareholders through dilution. So I'd say that's probably our number one thing. And the other thing is, which is maybe tied for first place, is talking to industry about this, because they're 70 years out of the business. They haven't Western industry have not been involved in graphite for ages. So it's as though they're getting into something new. And we have to, in some ways, I don't want to use the word educate, I guess, hold hands with them to show them that this can be done, and not focus on, to me, even talking about graphite prices. Again, like salt, we just need to make sure we can get it. We don't really have to worry so much if it costs more to pull out of the ground in Quebec than it does in China.
And look, yeah, China could turn the tap off tomorrow, although they would be shooting themselves in the foot if they did do that. But it is a real possibility, right?
Yeah, but as far as I understand, for the US, they have turned off the tap. It's an emergency situation right now. And like the Defense Logistics Agency just put out a few months ago a call. I mean, it's non-binding, so it's really just a information gathering exercise. But they want something like, I think it was 40,000 tons of graphite by 2032. you know, like, what? Um, and nobody really is in a position to give it to them, except for the most part, Chinese companies, and they're not going to do that. So, you're relying on your political adversaries and your business competition for an essential raw material, which, as a business model doesn't work, and as a defense strategy is pretty stupid.
Yeah, well, no, it sounds like there's quite a few factors at play at the moment that could potentially create a turn in the graphite market. So let's hope it's sooner rather than later.
Yeah. I think it's here really. And any company near production has to be very careful about how they negotiate. You can't compete with the Chinese market, and your customer needs to know that you're not going to, I'm turning off the tap too if you don't pay enough. And as a percentage of the manufacturer's cost, it's almost nothing.
And so, James, we're seeing that Chinese companies are expanding globally. So we're seeing in Africa, they're moving upstream. They own a number of mines there, and then they're moving further downstream in the likes of Morocco, Indonesia, Thailand, the US. So how do you see this impacting the global graphite market?
Yeah, well, it puts Western companies in even tougher position because that project, which could have been owned by a Western company, is now not. Instead, the Chinese, who already produce 75% of the world's graphite and, in manufacturing, produce even a higher percentage of that amount. So the downstream capacity they have is even more. So, yet they're going abroad to capture market share and to capture really reliance upon them. So if you're, a Western company and you see that a Chinese company has grabbed an asset in Tanzania or Mozambique and or Guinea, and they're essentially controlling that, that's one more off the table for you. So you better hurry if you want to secure graphite, while it still sits in the ground. Now, if you look at, say, Canada, the US, and Australia, it doesn't really appear too much that Chinese companies have taken control of those projects. So, but you better grab them while you can because time's running out because they're actively increasing their market share even beyond what they already have. And really that means increasing their dominance of you, the manufacturer.
Well, fantastic, James. It's been a pleasure to have you on here today and to share ePower's story. So, yeah, thanks for your time, and we look forward to having you again on here sometime soon.
Great. Harry, before we finish up, I've got one question for you.
Fire
How
away.
you're in a contract accountant, I think, from New
Yep.
Zealand, and
Yep.
you're in London now. How did
Yep.
you become so interested in graphite that you've put together one of the premier sources of information about it?
Yeah. Well, it's quite a long story, but probably don't have too much time to go into too much detail here. Long story short, growing up, I was quite fascinated in investing in the share market. So when I was quite young, I built up a portfolio of shares, and some of those companies were graphite companies. So this would have been about 6 or 7 years ago. So over that time, built up a bit of knowledge on the sector, and built up a good network. And then it would have been about a year and a half ago, I saw that there was a gap in the market for providing retail investors with information on graphite. As myself, I struggled to find any information that wasn't behind a paywall. So thought, why not try and create a central platform for all things graphite related? And here we are.
Great. Yeah, and I think everybody in the industry is going there looking for information, especially those weekly updates you send out. It's quickly become an information source just because there weren't any.
Exactly, and yeah, for the viewers out there, there's a lot in the works at the moment. So looking forward to providing some updates in the future on what Graphite Hub is and where we're going. It's an exciting time, that's for sure. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for tuning into this episode of Graphite Hub's interview series. We'll see you next time.